Thank you very much to the committee for inviting me. I'm a neonatal consultant from Newcastle in the north of England. I'm going to talk to you about assessment of nutritional status, and particularly what do we mean by nutritional status in preterm babies, why is it important, and how should we be assessing nutritional status. So this, of course, is a picture of the beautiful bridge just up the river here to remind you what you're missing today whilst you sit here and listen to us talk about nutrition. And this is to remind me that I could be in Newcastle, where the bridges look the same, but the weather is not so good. Here is some data from our unit over the last 15 years. And each of these lines represents the survival for these different gestation cutoffs. And I've picked out the bottom three lines there for 23-week babies, 24-week babies, and 25-week babies. And I like to tell people that I was appointed as a consultant in about 2000, and since then the outcomes have got better and better and better. But so this is where I started here, and everything's got better, but it's probably nothing to do with me at all. And I think back to what we were doing 10 years ago, and we have the same ventilators, and we have the same antibiotics, and we have the same surfactant and the same TPN, and everything's the same. So the question is, how are we getting these better outcomes? And I think it's partly due to the fact that we now provide these babies with much better nutrition than we used to. So across the board, outcomes are getting better for these very small babies, and all of you, like me, will be looking after babies weighing 500 or 600 grams every week. So we mustn't forget about these bigger babies at 28 and 29 weeks who never go on a ventilator and never become unwell. So we need to think about those, but a lot of our workload now is involved in looking after these very small babies. And as I say, this is a two-way discussion. Because survival is getting better, we have more small babies to look after, and more small babies then to be aware of their nutritional needs. But also in reverse, as our nutritional management gets better, I'm sure our survival therefore improves. So this is a circular discussion. And you all know that neonatal mortality is due to primarily respiratory disease in the first few days. But if you look at the changes in mortality over the last 10 or 20 years, you will see that death from respiratory disease has decreased quite significantly, but deaths from infection and NEC have become more important. And this is relevant to our discussion here today, because after the first week of life, most of the deaths that you see on the neonatal unit are due to either NEC or infection, and we know that both these two key outcomes are influenced by nutritional management. So nutrition really is key to improving mortality in these babies. Now, I want to persuade you that nutritional status is more complex than simply nutrient status. Okay? When people come and ask me questions, I think people believe that there might be some book with all the different weights and gestations put in there, and that you can just turn the page to a 26-week baby who's 11 days old and look up how much protein and how much calorie to give the baby. But nutritional status is more complex than this. And I would say that nutritional status is the composite of what you are, what you can do, and what you eat. So it depends on your past history. That may be your in utero past history, or your preceding 2 weeks on the neonatal unit. It depends on your predicted needs, and it depends on the nutrients that you're actually receiving. So for example, these babies here of the same gestation, this baby here very growth retarded, this baby here well grown, these babies clearly have very different nutrient requirements because of their previous existence. The needs in a baby here with a intestinal stoma are quite different from a baby of the same weight and gestation who does not have a stoma. And the nutrient intake is important, but I put the parenteral nutrition and the breast milk side by side because we can't simply say that having a gram of protein in parenteral nutrition is as good as a gram of protein from breast milk. So we all like to talk about protein and calorie and grams and millimoles, but we need to be aware that nutritional intake is more than just nutrient intake alone. And there is now a lot of evidence that how we nourish the babies and how they are nourished themselves before they're born, from the embryonic period through to fetal growth and then infancy, that growth in what we call the first 1,000 days is a critical determinant not only of cognition long-term for our preterm babies, but of metabolic outcome. So the 1,000-day period spans from conception until you're around about 2 years of age. And there is now a lot of work showing that how you feed babies and how they grow during this period has a long-term impact on later life outcomes. So the key point so far is that survival is improving and that nutrition is vital to these survivors. Nutritional status is more complex than just nutrient intake, and it depends on your past history and your predicted needs. And the first 1,000 days are important. So are we doing a good job? So this is Richard's data that he showed you earlier. I know it's almost 20 years out of date, but again, just to highlight that the average discharge centile for all these babies less than 30 weeks is below the 10th centile. And although we talk about weight, we're not so bothered about weight. It doesn't really matter whether you weigh 2.2 kilos or 2.6 kilos at discharge. The weight doesn't matter. It's the weight gain that's important. So weight gain is a very reliable marker of poor nutrition. If the baby is not growing properly, then nutritional status is not optimal. And if the nutritional status is not optimal, we can expect that their cognitive outcome, their growth outcomes, their body compositional outcomes, and potentially their metabolic outcomes are going to be suboptimal. So it's growth we're talking about, it's weight gain that's important, not the weight itself. So why is it that we're so bad at nutrition? I can think back 20 years ago to when I first started as a resident on the neonatal unit. And like many of you, I was completely terrified of these small babies and all this equipment and the x-rays and the consultants who wanted to know, what was the blood gas and what was the serum glucose, and you're panicking about everything. And what we tend to do is focus on what we can see in front of us. So particularly from the respiratory point of view, we think about how much oxygen is the baby in and what does the chest x-ray look like and what settings should I put, and are we going to be using pressure support or assist control, and they're talking about all these funny things in those rooms over there, and none of it really matters. This is the session to be in. You can forget about all these different modes, but people spend ages talking about how we ventilate these babies, and then we do some scans and we see these brain scans and we get very worried about what we're going to say to parents. So we become very focused on what we can see in front of us. And neonatal intensive care is very complex. We have to think about the baby getting jaundiced and whether we should put a central line in. What fluids, do we start on 100 or 80 or 60, and how quickly? Does he need inotropes? What's the blood pressure? What should the blood pressure be? Is 30 okay? Will my consultant be upset if he comes in and the blood pressure is only 28 and I haven't given extra fluid or some steroid or something? What's the oxygen saturation? Should I keep it at 90 to 95 or maybe 88 to 95? Should I put the baby on antibiotics? Which antibiotics? Do I take a CRP? What was the blood gas? When should I take the next blood gas? The baby's cold. Should I put him in a bag or an overhead heater? How much urine output do the nurses measure? And what do I set the ventilation at? So we think about all these things. And because we're so focused on these things, nutrition takes a back seat. People just don't think about nutrition because it's not in front of you to see the problems that you're creating. And malnutrition is therefore invisible. Here's a picture of a baby at birth, and here is a picture of the baby 48 hours after you haven't given them any protein. And he looks exactly the same. So malnutrition is invisible. So here's a picture from my unit. Here's one of my colleagues here, busy doing some work next door. Here we have these bags of standard TPN covered in a red light protecting thing. None of my residents or fellows have any idea what's in that red bag. It's just a magic red bag. And as long as the baby's connected to the red bag, then they can tick nutrition and forget about it. And we have a monitor here, and it tells you every second, are you giving the baby enough oxygen? Are you giving enough inotrope? Is the heart rate too fast or too slow? And if the oxygen just goes down a little bit, the nurse rushes and they turn the oxygen up a little bit, or if it's too high, they turn it down. So continually, you have all this feedback information that helps you manage the baby as well as you can. But nothing on that monitor tells me anything about nutritional status. And I say to people, wouldn't it be nice if I could design this monitor here and it would give me a minute-by-minute printout of, your energy status is falling off a bit here, but look what you've done to protein. If I had that monitor there, I think my residents, my nurses would be there tweaking up the protein, tweaking up the calories and doing something about it. But we don't get any feedback, so we have no idea what a poor job we're doing. So when I say to my residents, right, can you go off and assess the nutritional status of that baby? They look at me and they say, well, what do you mean nutritional status? I say, well, just go off and assess nutritional status. They say, well, do you want to weigh the baby? And I said, no, just go off and weigh the baby. Just go off and assess it. And they look confused. So I said, right, can you go and tell me about this baby's respiratory status? And they'll say, well, he had an X-ray which shows some pattern of surfactant deficiency, and his respiratory rate's increased. He looks a bit blue. The oxygen saturation is this. The FiO2 is this. The latest blood gas shows this. And they might listen to the chest and say, I can hear some crackles. So if I said to somebody who assessed respiratory status, that's easy. But if they go and assess the cardiovascular status, they would tell me about the blood pressure. They might do a scan, might look for a PDA. They would talk about blood pressures. They might listen to the murmurs. So for a cardiovascular status, people have got a good idea. When I say nutritional status, they go, well, what do you want me to do? And what I want to do is try and give you a simple idea of how I think about nutritional status. If I push them enough, they say, yeah, maybe I better measure the head circumference, and I'll get that weight, and I'll plot it on a chart. That's about as much as they might do. And if I wait a bit longer, they go, well, I might measure the urea or the glucose. And that then finishes, and we don't know where to go from there. And when I first started doing nutrition, I was absolutely convinced that there were blood tests that my seniors just hadn't told me about, that were there to be explored and discovered, and that I would be able to take a blood from a baby, and I'd fill in my form here, preterm baby, 26 weeks, send it off to the lab, nutritional status. I've put please here, because if you say please and underline it, then people are really nice, and they take that small sample of blood, and then I would get a nice report back, and it would say, Infant Smith, nutritional status, well, protein alert, energy stable, vitamin A alert. I thought that's how you did nutrition. And of course, that isn't how you do it, but it wouldn't be nice if it was as simple as that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about why blood measures of nutritional status are not really very helpful. Instead, you get this back with AST and LLT and ALT-FOS and gamma-GT and total protein, and you're a bit confused, and if you're interested in nutrition, you think, well, I better look at the thing that says protein and albumin, and maybe that'll tell me something. But none of this really helps us assess nutritional status. So nutritional status is poorly defined, it's difficult to assess, and the key outcomes of your nutritional management are often not apparent in the short term. We expect our babies to lose weight, but they all look the same even when they've lost their weight. So, nutritional status, what you eat, what you are, what you can do, and the what you are bit is very important to preterm babies because they are unique in terms of their brain growth and the requirements they have to support brain growth. So I normally offer a prize to my residents when I'm doing this talk for the resident who can spot the brain inside the skull of the rhinoceros. So if anybody can spot it, you can put your hand up. I'll let you look a little bit longer while I have a drink. Okay, so that's where the brain is in the rhinoceros. So this great big animal and a great big head, but actually a tiny, tiny little brain inside that big head. Humans, in comparison, have a brain that fills the entire cranial cavity. I know this is true because this is my son. So thank you. I have 4 children, and they all say, "Daddy, is it going to be my slide in the photo when you go to Portugal?" And I said, "No, this time it's Jamie's turn." So, okay. So we have a huge brain, and that's what makes us different. That's why preterm infants are unique. So here's another way of looking at it. So up here is the log of your brain weight, logarithmic scale, and here's body weight, is a logarithmic scale. And here we've got a rhinoceros. This line here is the average for mammals. You see here a rhinoceros, a little bit more stupid than the average mammal. Same for a little vole. Chimpanzee, not surprising, a bit above average. My pet dog, very cute, but only averagely clever. But humans are here, and this is a logarithmic scale. And when you look at it like this, you can see that the human brain is probably 10 to 20 times as big as every other mammal. And everything about fetal development, growth in the womb, placental function, breast milk, has all evolved to support brain growth. That's what we're here for. Look at the brain growth spurt. So I always imagined that chimpanzees and other primates would have a brain growth pattern that was similar to humans. I should have known that wasn't true, because I can remember my parents taking me to the zoo when I was a small child and seeing a newborn monkey, and these newborn monkeys, they can crawl around and they can hang on to things and they can get to the mother's breast if they wanted to. Whereas a human, think about a newborn human baby, newborn humans are completely pathetic. You could lie a newborn baby 5 centimeters from his mother's breast, he couldn't get there. Okay, so humans are very immature. And the brain growth spurt in humans happens prior to, but also after term. So brain growth is happening at a very different stage in humans to most other mammals. And between 24 weeks gestation and 2 years of life, so sort of covering quite a lot of this first 1,000 days, we acquire about 90% of our final brain volume. So the period that we as neonatologists and paediatricians, when we're following these babies up, the period that we're responsible for their nutrition represents 90% of their brain volume acquisition. And of course, during this process, there are lots of different phases taking place. So there's neuronal migration happening throughout the first 3 trimesters, apoptosis, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd trimester, synaptogenesis, mainly in the 3rd trimester, but throughout infancy, and myelination that carries on until maybe you're 20 years of age. And the impact of poor nutrition on later cognitive or neurodevelopmental outcome depends on when your insult happens. So a problem here, where you're not providing enough nutrition, will result in a different brain outcome to not providing good nutrition at this point in time here. So this is a paper that just came out in Paediatrics. That's another nice way of looking at it. This is the brain volume increasing here between 24 weeks and 40 weeks gestation. So increasing here. Very smooth brain, as you know, at 24 weeks, very folded, complex brain at 40 weeks. And this is the cortical surface area. So a massive increase in cortical folding and surface area during those 16 weeks. Imagine the amount of energy that is required for the brain to reorganize itself like that. So the key points. The brain's vulnerable. Malnutrition is very common. I could go to any of your units, and you could probably come to my unit, and we would see every baby being malnourished. Malnourishment results in worse outcomes. The nutritional status, say, is more complex than nutrients alone. So how do we assess nutritional status? Well, we need to first of all understand what it is that preterm babies are made of. And then we can have an idea of what their nutrient stores are like. And this is based on a lot of work from Eckhart Ziegler and Bill Hurd, maybe sort of 20, 30 years ago now. This is data from Eckhart Ziegler, where he put together a series of studies. This is now it's published like 40 years ago now, 1976. But what he shows you is that at 24 weeks gestation, you're about 90% water. You've got about 8% protein and just a tiny amount of mineral, tiny amounts of lipid in your brain and your cell membranes, your retina. But there are no fat stores, as you know, at 24 weeks gestation. So you're 90% water. Just think what that means. So here's our 24-week baby, 500 grams, 90% water. This baby just has 50 grams of dry tissue. Has no energy stores at all. So the only tissue available for energy, if you're not going to meet it with your nutrient intakes, is going to be for that baby to catabolize its own lean mass, either muscle, diaphragmatic muscle, skeletal muscle, liver. There is nothing else for that baby to use. Okay. So babies have limited nutrient stores, lots of morbidities. How do we take that data of Ziegler and understand then how much protein to give the baby? Now I'm just going to quickly explain protein, amino acids, and nitrogen, because I knew none of this when I was doing my training. People talked about nitrogen, and nitrogen was the sort of thing that the dietitians talked about, but as clinicians, I didn't really understand what nitrogen was. Protein, as you know, is composed of 20 amino acids that are strung together in a great big long chain, and then folded and twisted together. That's how your proteins are made. So proteins are made up of a series of amino acids. And our requirement as humans is for amino acids and not protein itself. So we can survive just on amino acids. We choose to eat it as protein because it's nice to eat protein, and that's what's available, but our requirement is for amino acids. And as you know, amino acids are either essential or non-essential, but we need to be aware that in preterm babies, some non-essential amino acids are considered to be conditionally essential. Glutamine, glycine, proline, these ones may have specific high requirements in preterm babies. And we then use nitrogen as the exchange currency. And nitrogen allows us to convert between amino acids and protein, so that when you talk about your bag of TPM providing 3 grams of protein, there's no protein in that bag, it's amino acids. But it's nitrogen that allows us to convert between amino acids and protein. And very roughly, if you multiply your nitrogen amount by 6.25, you estimate how much protein you've got. And this number 6.25 depends a little bit on what you're talking about. So it's a bit higher for milk, a bit lower if it's plant protein. And this was all worked out by a guy called Kejdal, who reckoned that most protein contained about 16% nitrogen. So that's just quickly how you convert between nitrogen and protein, but that's important for my next few slides. So of course, when you stick a baby on a ventilator and they breathe, you're pumping in nitrogen all the time. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic if babies could actually utilize all that nitrogen? We struggle to get all the protein into them. Of course, animals are not able to use atmospheric nitrogen. It just all comes out again. So we require protein or amino acids in our diet to actually make our protein compounds for. So assessing protein requirements, this is based on the work of Ziegler, and what we can see is that babies or fetuses store about 2 grams a kilo a day of protein, and that's fairly constant throughout the weeks between about 24 and 30. So you know that you're going to have to give the baby more than 2 grams if you want him to retain at least 2 grams. But remember that the conversion of dietary protein isn't 100% efficient, and every day you're losing nitrogen. And these losses of nitrogen, obligatory losses, are very, very high in preterm babies. And that's partly because they have such high requirements for growth, but also because there's a massive amount of protein turnover. And for every 1 gram of protein that you deposit, preterm babies probably make 5 or 10 other grams of protein that is then broken down again. So protein anabolism is a very, very dynamic picture. So how rapid is that protein turnover, and how much protein are these babies losing? So here are 10 studies in the first week of life, babies of an average gestation of 31 weeks. These are all the studies here. You can find the literature, but mainly in the 90s and the early 2000s. And what I've done here is each circle here represents the mean for one of the groups in a study. So most of these studies were controlled trials with 2 groups. And they plot out along the line here. So this is protein intake here. So this is 1 gram a day, 2 grams a day, 3 grams a day. And then this is your nitrogen retention, which is how you measure it, because we can't we call protein retention, but that we then use nitrogen retention to estimate what protein retention has been. And you can see that most of these studies pretty much fit a nice, neat line here. The important points to make are that at a protein intake of 0, you lose around about 160 milligrams of nitrogen a day, which when you back calculate quite nicely works out to be a gram per kilo a day of protein that you're losing. That's the first point. So at no protein, you're losing at least a gram a day. When you give the baby a gram a day of protein, what you would then expect is that you would convert that nitrogen loss into nitrogen balance. So that works quite nicely. The line goes around about 1 here. When you're giving 1 milligram, you're neither gaining nor losing protein. But if you want the baby to retain protein at the rate of the fetus, so about 320 milligrams here, you can see that your protein intake is going to have to be at least around about 3 or 3.5 grams a kilo a day if you're going to get anywhere near fetal accretion rates. That's before you've considered the additional losses caused by infection or stress or needs for catch-up. So we can guess that your protein intake is going to have to be way over 3 if these babies are going to grow anywhere near like the fetus. What's more, most of these studies here were in babies around about 31 weeks. If you shift the line down to where you would expect it to be for babies at 26 weeks, you can see that nitrogen balance, to achieve nitrogen balance, you're going to have to give at least 1.5 grams a kilo a day. So when you see that bag of red TPN hanging there and you imagine that you've done your nutrition, you're not helping this baby grow. You might be stopping him from getting smaller, but you're probably not providing enough to grow. And we can put all this together to work out how much protein then to give babies. So around about 2 grams of protein accretion, about 1.5 grams of nitrogen we're losing in the urine, some allowance for the nitrogen lost in skin cells and secretions, and then you can add in an additional factor, which is the inefficiency of converting dietary protein, breaking it down to amino acids, and then converting it into muscle protein. And when you map this out over the 40 weeks of gestation, it looks something like that. And therefore, you can guess that between about 24 and 30 weeks, you're going to have to give at least 3.5 to 4 grams of protein if you want the baby to grow anywhere near like the fetus. How vulnerable is the baby to lack of nutrients? So here, I just want to think about energy. And I'm depicting the total energy in your body as a red circle. And this is all the glycogen, fat, and protein that you have in your body. And we can work out energy expenditure, and I'm not going to go through this, but your resting energy expenditure in a baby is somewhere between about 50 and 60 kcals a kilo a day. So for a 32-weeker who has about 2,000 calories stored, if we looked at what your resting energy expenditure would be required a day, it looks like this. So each of these little segments coming out is 1 day of energy coming out from this baby's store. That's the picture you'd see for a 32-weeker. This is what it looks like for a 26-weeker. 1, 2, 3 days, bang. You've used up a third of your total body protein. You'll be dead. So a baby at 1,000 grams has no more than about 2.5 or 3 days of stored energy if you didn't supply it before he would be dead. So that's how critical we are with these babies. Let's have a look at what that would mean. Here's this baby. He's born at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. You ring the pharmacy. They say, we're closed for the weekend. Give us a call on Monday morning. So you ring them at 6 in the morning and you order 3 grams and you start at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's pretty good going. You think, we've done a good job here. Let's look at what that would mean for a 500-gram baby. So on Friday, he's got 50 grams of protein. On Monday, if he'd stayed as a fetus, he should have 55 grams of protein. Unfortunately, he's born and after 18 hours, he loses a gram of protein in his urine. You can't do anything about it. And over the next 3 days, he loses a gram of protein every 18 hours. That's what the data tell you is going to happen. So that by Monday morning, his protein is about 46 grams. And if you do the maths, by Monday morning, he will only have the lean mass 85% of what it would have been if he'd stayed in utero. For you to do that to an adult would have taken you a month. Okay, but in babies, you can do it over the weekend if you don't provide them with nutrition. So the brain is vulnerable. Malnutrition is very common. We need to give at least 3.5 or 4 grams to meet these needs. So finally, assessing nutritional status is as easy as ABC. So the A stands for anthropometry. I put body composition in there as well. B is biochemistry. C is clinical assessments. And D is dietary assessments. I'm going to go through each of those one by one. And this is what we would consider to be direct assessment of nutritional intake, the ABCD, what the babies are actually getting. You could think about indirect assessment of nutritional status, and this might be looking at your unit guidelines, as Rich was talking about, looking at the attitudes and beliefs of staff that influence how much priority you give to nutrition, what's your equipment like, what your resources like, what your pharmacy opening hours like, what's actually in a standard bag of your TPN, and you can look at unit-specific data, what's your average weight at discharge and age at full feeds, duration of PNs. These are all the indirect ways you could assess nutritional status, but I'm focusing here on direct measures. For anthropometry, you will know that we should be measuring weight and head regularly. We can argue perhaps in the afternoon session about whether you should be measuring length. These other measures, mid-arm, skin fold, knee heel, they lack references, and I think it's difficult to know how they would influence your management. Most of these calculations, BMI and ponderal index, again, it's difficult to know clinically whether they should make any difference to how you manage them. But of course, weight, head, and probably length, cheap, specific, very sensitive, easy to repeat them, incredibly safe. There are, of course, issues about training, making sure people really know how to weigh and length babies properly. There's a bit of variability between the different clinicians. They're relatively non-invasive. As Richard was talking about, we could argue all day about which growth chart you should be using. I don't think it matters. Just pick any growth chart and make sure you use it. As I say, we're interested in growth, not size, so it's the pattern over time that's important. And don't get too focused about specific cutoffs for SGA. I don't think that's important. So anthropometry is the first key part of nutritional status. Body composition currently still really is primarily a research tool. But it is possible to reasonably accurately assess lean mass. If you can measure body water, you can subtract and guesstimate fat mass in a baby. Measuring bone mineral density is pretty specific with modern DEXAs. So there's some good body composition tools out there, but primarily they're for research at the minute and not used clinically. But all these different methodologies require different models, different assumptions and algorithms. Nobody really knows what the gold standard is. There's still a lot of questions about body composition assessment in preterm babies. We've tried to use bioimpedance because it's very cheap, safe and repeatable, but it's incredibly fiddly to get the electrodes on the baby and to get the baby to stay still. And even then, you've then got to calculate and estimate body water and body fat. So I don't think bioimpedance is likely to be very helpful for us. DEXA are very widely used. It's pretty easy to use it. Gives you pretty specific measures of fat and lean mass. But I'm not sure that clinically it's very relevant to us at the minute. Isotope dilution is expensive and not a clinical methodology. And then there are these newer ones, MRI and bone, speed of sound. Again, we can talk about later if people are interested. So the B of the ABCD is biochemistry. Glucose and electrolytes obviously pretty important to assessing your acute nutritional status, but it's impossible to quantify macronutrient stores biochemically. So no blood test will ever tell you how much protein you've got in your body and whether you've got enough protein, whether it's adequate. It's never going to happen. Biochemistry probably is important in assessing micronutrient status, and that's particularly important for complex babies and babies who are on prolonged PN, but it's probably not important for your babies who are just on PN for the first 2 weeks. There are issues about sampling and light protection and the assays that you use. But very importantly, remember that for many of the things you're measuring, so particularly vitamins, but certainly quite a lot of your electrolytes and minerals, the plasma level does not reflect total body stores. And I think people imagine that if you measure the plasma sodium level and it's normal, that the baby must have got enough sodium in the body. That's not true at all. The babies will maintain their plasma levels of most of these electrolytes until body stores are so critical and they can't keep them more normal. So a normal plasma level does not tell you that you've got enough of that nutrient there, but it may be a useful guide. So somebody asked a question about urea and assessment of protein status. Total serum protein is a completely useless measure of nutritional status. I never look at it. Albumin has an incredibly long half-life about 21 days. So albumin is never going to never indicate your nutritional status except over a very long period of time. So you can ignore albumin. My surgeons get very fixated on it, but I think it's irrelevant. There are some proteins with shorter half-lives, so particularly retinol binding protein, prealbumin, transthyretin, but these are only really used in a research setting. And although most labs will measure retinol binding protein, most hospitals can measure this pretty easily. We haven't got any references to know really what it should be. So again, I don't think you need to worry about that. Urea, after the first week, when you're enterally feeding, your serum level of urea is quite tightly linked to your protein intake. And there is a bit of work, I think, showing that you can change your nutrient intake based on the urea, that if your urea is low, less than about 2 millimoles, you're probably not giving the baby enough protein, and you can probably safely give them maybe more protein. But that only applies to babies, I think, on enteral nutrition once their urea synthetic capacity has really kicked in. In the first few days, babies haven't got the right enzymes to make the urea, and the level of urea that you see in babies on PN bears no relationship to the intake of amino acids. So I ignore it completely. They measure it, but I just ignore it. People come along and say the urea is 10 or 12. I say, just forget it, all right? So I take no interest in the urea in the first few days. It does not accurately reflect protein intake. And plasma amino acid profiles, I put a red cross next to it. They probably are useful in a research setting if you're doing a trial of different levels of amino acids. But they're pretty expensive to measure. And as Richard says, we have no idea what reference you should use. Should you be using a well-breastfed term baby or well-breastfed preterm baby, or should you be using cord blood, fetal profiles of amino acids? No idea. So I think they are useful, but in a clinical setting, I think you can just forget about them. I don't think they ever tell you what you're doing in terms of nutrition. Bone biochemistry, metabolic bone disease is pretty common. Everybody gets very excited about it. There are lots of papers. I have to say, it doesn't really get me going because the data linking mineral status, bone mineral status in early life to later outcomes isn't really there. So the studies that have these long-term data, so this is particularly Mary Futrell from Alan Lucas's group, show no association between bone density in later life and your bone mineral density status as a neonate. No relationship at all. So I'm not saying we should ignore bone mineral status, but I don't think you need to be as worried about it as you should be about protein and energy intake. X-rays, completely useless in assessing whether you're giving enough calcium and phosphate. Your X-rays won't look abnormal until you've lost more than half of your bone minerals, so that's way too late. DEX is probably impractical to measure it in a clinical setting. Alk phos, again, everybody loves to measure alkaline phosphatase, but again, I don't think there's any good data that it tells you how you should manage these babies unless it's off the scale. Your alkaline phosphatase only starts to increase when you've given the baby enough protein for his bones to start growing. So you'll see your alk phos go up at the point in time that you're giving the baby enough protein and energy to grow. When you're not giving him enough protein and energy, his alk phos will stay normal because his osteoblasts are not trying to make any bone. Okay? So it's not a reliable indicator that you're providing these babies with enough calcium and phosphate. So people always measure it, but I've never really found it very helpful. I like to look at it, but that's about it. Calcium. So as I said, serum calcium does not tell you anything about your total body stores. It will stay completely normal even when all your bones have disappeared completely. Phosphate, as we heard, is very important. It does reflect recent intake. It probably is important to measure it in the acute stage when you're giving babies PM, because as we heard, if you don't give the babies enough phosphate and you're tipping lots of amino acid into them, in the babies who've been growth restricted in utero, they may well drop their phosphate level. So I think we're only just starting to get a feel for how this works, but you need phosphate For your muscles to work, you need it for cell function. So if your baby has not got a normal serum phosphate level, he may not have enough energy to make his muscles work really properly. So we do need to think about it. But also remember that you don't really need calcium to deposit lean mass, but you do need phosphate. You can give a baby all the protein in the world, but if you don't give enough phosphate, you can't turn that into body protein. So you have to have phosphate in your diet. So particularly probably important in the acute setting, but it's also really important in babies where you're giving breast milk that we know is going to be depleting phosphate. So almost all your babies are going to need extra phosphate. The C bit of clinical nutritional status, the clinical bit, is completely useless. If you wait until your baby has signs of visible nutrition, you've left it long too late and the baby's brain is probably damaged. So I think you can probably forget the clinical bit of the ABCD. If you're doing the growth measurements and you're thinking about the other aspects, the clinical bit doesn't really apply to preterm babies. We never see these things. So of course we see wasting in a baby, but vitamin A deficiency in the eye and zinc deficiency, if you wait till you see those things before you start doing about it, you've left it weeks too late. So we've talked about anthropometry, biochemistry. C is for sort of body composition, clinical assessment and dietary assessment, and we've thought about indirect measures. So just finally, the problem that I face on my unit is I have no dietitians. I have a pharmacist who makes PN and who comes for 1 hour in the morning. None of my colleagues are particularly interested in nutrition. They're far more interested in scanning machines and ventilators. We have a standard bag of TPN, so nobody has to think about what they put in the bag, and we have a standard feeding guideline. So people don't really think about nutrition in the way that they should do. But we need to encourage people to focus on growth, anthropometry, and dietary assessment. We need to make it something we discuss every day on the ward round, and we need to document it in the notes. And what I'm developing is something like this, which is this is a little sticker that we have a great big roll of it, and you can peel it off, and you can stick it in the notes. And I get my residents to do it. And what it does is it looks like this. So it has a column for your current weight, your weight centile, the birth weight centile. It gets you to work out the weight gain over the last 5 days, the weight gain since the baby regained the birth weight, and the head circumference centile. So hopefully it encourages them to think about, did I weigh the baby, if I plotted it, if I measured the head? Then these are all the different intakes you can have. You write in the volume here, so you just need to stand there and look at the chart and write down how many mils the baby had in the last 24-hour period, the complete 24-hour period. You can then convert that into the amount per mils per kilo a day, and then use these standardized formulas. You can work out how much protein the baby got from breast milk or from the fortifier, and you can add it all up. And this one comes out. So here's the baby here, 790 grams on the 3rd centile, but he was 650 grams at birth and was on the 25th centile. And here you can see the weight gain has only been 14 grams a day. We put a little tick in or a cross just to remind people, are they prescribing the baby extra vitamins or iron or a probiotic, which we use. You write down the volume of milk. So here's a baby, not even 800 grams, but they're on 80 mils of milk and some fortifier, and they're still on TPN. And you would imagine that baby was getting a pretty decent nutritional intake. And most people would be really happy. But when you actually calculate exactly what this baby's getting, this baby's only getting 2.9 grams of protein and just over 100 kcal. So it looks fantastic. Here's a baby who's growing, who's on breast milk and on PN and on fortifier. But actually, when you actually do the calculation, you can see you're not giving this baby enough. And the idea is that we'll have these made up as a sticky, and then periodically you can get someone to do it. And the idea is just to give you that feedback. As I said in the first slide, that we're missing. We don't get any feedback from our nutritional management. Here's a way of tying your clinical staff into just thinking about nutritional status. So I'm going to finish here with a picture here that I thought looked like the bridge that's just up the river there. But this isn't the drawing for the bridge. This, in fact, is rocket science. So this is a calculation used for working out how quickly and how much energy you need to give a rocket to take off. And I put that there because I want to persuade you that assessing nutritional status is not like rocket science. Actually, it's relatively straightforward. that we need to think about what we mean by nutritional status, how we assess it, the importance of the brain, remembering how much protein the babies lose, and the vulnerability that they have to early energy deprivation. And with 25 seconds to spare, I'm going to finish there. So thank you.